Today I'm going to show you how I turned this sleeping bag into a cute puffer jacket. I bought this kid's sleeping bag at Goodwill and knew I wanted to design a jacket that would incorporate that original branding and wavy design. So I first unzipped the sleeping bag to see what I was working with, laid it flat, and then removed this pouch thing, a pocket, and this little Velcro tab that was underneath it. Then I used a jacket I already owned as a guide to trace the pattern pieces using a washable fabric marker. I turned the jacket inside out and traced around the edge as close to the jacket seam as possible, making sure the Swiss gear logo over here would end up on the upper part of the bust area. I then added about 2 inches all the way around for seam allowance and cut out the first pattern piece. And here's what the first piece looks like. I then used the front piece I just cut out as a pattern for the second front piece. I placed it face down on the opposite edge of the sleeping bag, making sure the seams matched up. I clipped it in place and then cut. And here's what the 2 front pieces look like so far. For the back of the jacket, I traced around the edge of my jacket again and made sure to position it so the sleeping bag's seam was centered, and included part of that green wave design thing on the back. I measured a 2-inch seam allowance again all the way around and cut out the back piece. Here's another little preview of what we've got going on so far. It's not quite even in length, but we'll fix that later. With the remaining sleeping bag fabric, I folded it in half to cut out the first sleeve. I made sure the wrist end of the sleeve would line up with an existing finished hem on the sleeping bag, so I wouldn't have to worry about hemming it at the end. Then, just like the other pattern pieces, I traced around my jacket sleeve and then clipped the pieces together so they wouldn't slide and cut all the way around them, eyeballing about a 1-inch seam allowance. I then used the first sleeve as a pattern for the second sleeve and cut that out. And would you look at that, I'm starting to see a coat here. The next thing I did was seam rip the existing zipper and bias tape on the front panels. I seam ripped that part instead of just cutting because I wanted to make sure I had enough fabric to attach the new zipper without getting too close to the Swiss gear logo. And at this point in the project, I got a little bold and ended up trimming the seam allowance down to about 1 inch or so, and in hindsight, I really wish I didn't. You'll see why later, but essentially I needed that extra inch to prevent mistakes. In any case, I bought this pale green thread to match the existing sleeping bag thread, loaded my bobbin, threaded my machine, and got sewing. But at this point, all I did was sew all the way around the edges of each individual piece to help lock in the fluffy stuff, which I was hoping would make all of these pieces easier to attach later. Here's what all those pieces look like now. Then I clipped the front panel pieces to the back piece and sewed along the sides. And here's what we're looking like right now. As I laid this vest-like thing over my existing jacket, I realized the shoulders could use a slight angle, so I marked a line on both sides with my fabric pen, double-checking the marks were roughly the same length and height, and sewed the shoulders together. I was so excited to try this little vest on and see that we were getting somewhere. While it was off to a good start, I needed a little more room in the neckline. So I marked and measured and cut a curve. Then it was time to figure out the collar. I wanted to incorporate this Velcro strap as part of the collar, so I cut these 2 little strips out and sewed them together. And here's an example of something that happened to me several times during this project when I didn't leave a big enough seam allowance. I re-sewed this spot like 3 times to finally get it to attach properly. Anyways, I took a break from the collar and sewed the arm seams together. This time, I just went ahead and sewed the seams together without sewing around the edge of the pattern piece first, like I did on the other pieces. It didn't seem to make a difference this time, but I do think I just got lucky. At this point, I had to do another try-on, and yay, it keeps looking more and more like a jacket. To attach the sleeves, I turned the vest piece inside out and lined up the arm pieces at the arm holes. But before attaching them, I did sew around the edges of the sleeves to lock in the fluffy stuff. I then clipped the sleeves to the armholes, creating this very intimidating situation, and then sewed all the way around both armholes. On my first attempt, I ended up with some bunching at the shoulder areas, so seam ripped and tried again, making sure my final stitches would end at the armpit so any mistakes wouldn't be as noticeable. And here I present a jacket with sleeves. Next, it was time to attach the collar. I realized I needed to trim the neckline down a little bit more than I already did so the collar would sit further from my neck. So I did that, then found another jacket I owned that had an actual collar to reference to see how tall it needed to be. I gave my collar a trim and started sewing it to the jacket. And this was a prime example of why a larger seam allowance would have been better. The presser foot just smashes those thick layers so much that the slippery fabric gets pushed past the needle and leaves gaps. Wow. Sheesh. This was no good. And for more than one reason, I seam ripped my first attempt and tried this step again. But I needed a little break from that disappointment, so I decided to work on some of the collar details. I first cut this little Velcro flap thing that I'd reattach later, and seam ripped some leftover zipper and bias tape that was still attached to the collar. With a clean start to the collar, I tried attaching it to the jacket again. Another tip or lesson I learned was that it's helpful to lower your sewing machine's feed dog when positioning this thick yet somewhat snag-prone fabric under the needle. And in case you don't know, the feed dog is this pointed metal plate thing that's part of your machine that helps pull the fabric through as you sew. After your fabric is positioned where you want it to be under the needle, just remember to put your feed dogs back up before sewing, otherwise you'll end up sewing in place. I did that. I definitely did that. Now that the collar was successfully attached, it was time for the zipper. I pinned half of the zipper to the jacket with the teeth facing outward and sewed it on. I used a two-way 26-inch parka zipper, which is a nice sturdy type of zipper for a thick coat that will allegedly not corrode or freeze in the elements, so that's nice. I then attached the second side of the zipper, but I realized I forgot to incorporate that little Velcro strap thing. And before I show you what I meant to do, let me show you what I did first. Can you guess what's wrong with this picture? I couldn't at first, but I'll give you a few seconds. Yep, it's attached to the wrong side. I mean, I guess it could have worked like that, sure, but that would have defeated the purpose of having a Velcro closure reinforcement. Anyways, after more frustrated seam ripping, I sewed the flap to the correct side between the zipper and the collar, so it'd be hidden in between. Now for the jacket's hem. This was another area of trial and error. I'll again show you what I tried first and how it went wrong. I folded and sewed like a regular hem, but because this fluff is so thick, it didn't quite catch all the way around. Plus, with this method, I would have had to come up with a way to hide the fluffy seam later. So what I ended up doing was trimming the inside fluff to the length of where the zipper ended and folded both pieces of fabric inward. Then pinned and sewed across. The result was a much cleaner hem. Now it was time to hide all these messy, fluffy seams using bias binding. I used this extra wide 1/2-inch bias tape, which looked really similar to the bias tape that was on the original sleeping bag, so I figured it would work well. And if you've never used bias tape before, literally this was my first time, the idea is that it basically folds over your seams to hide them. Before I attached any bias tape, I trimmed as close to the seam as I could to remove as much of this bulky fluff as possible. Then to attach the bias tape, you basically open it up and sew along that first inner crease at your seam. So I pinned along that line, and then the idea is that I'll fold it over and sew along the other side to lock it all in. I switched to black thread at this point and then attached the bias tape. And here's what we're looking like so far. I then folded the bias tape to the other side, pinned it, and sewed along that edge. And this is what the finished bias binding looks like. And another little lesson, an easy way to make a nice finish on an open edge of bias tape is to fold over that exposed edge and then fold over the other side. Here's a finished edge versus an exposed edge. The finished one just hides that fluff in the seam so much better. At this point, I had my work cut out for me, finishing that bias binding. I did one section at a time in a certain order, so I could basically hide the edges of the lower layers under the new layers, if that makes sense. So I basically started with these seams, then did the collar, the armholes, and then saved the part next to the zipper for last. But if I were doing this project again, I'd keep it really simple and would probably have serged all the way around the pattern pieces before even attaching them together to avoid dealing with all this fluffy stuff on the inside at the end. You could also try a zigzag stitch on a regular sewing machine. I do think I would still use bias binding near the zipper and maybe at the collar, since those parts are visible when wearing the jacket. Anyways, I forged ahead with this mega bias binding journey by pinning and sewing and pinning and sewing. And oh my gosh, this was so tedious, and there were lots of little spots that I had to accept would not be perfect. But here's what the jacket looked like once I gave my best effort. Now I just needed to attach the bias binding next to the zipper. So I did the usual pinning and sewing and pinning and sewing. And before I wrap this part up, I want to show you how I finished the zipper edge. The top of the zipper edge had this little piece hanging, so to hide it, I folded it along with the bias binding, just like I showed you when I finished that other edge. It's basically the same idea, but this time the zipper edge is hiding inside of all of that. After finishing all of the bias binding, I had to fix a few little spots, including an open seam in the collar and at the sleeve, so I switched back to a green thread and sewed those parts together. I also, regrettably, had a few spots I needed to hand sew because I didn't bother fixing these in the moment. I really wish I did, because this just doesn't look as great. And just to note, I chose not to add bias binding to the inside sleeves because the jacket already felt a tad snug at this point, so I didn't want to risk adding any extra bulk. And if I'm being honest, I was simply bias binded out. Okay, without further ado, here's the final jacket. It's far from perfect, but I'm so happy with how it turned out, considering this was my first time using bias binding and my first time installing a zipper. I might add pockets later, but I'm terrified of ruining a good thing and just want to celebrate the fact that I made a freaking jacket out of a sleeping bag. So there you have it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. It helps people find my videos. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Until next time, happy sewing. Bye!